I'd like to just say a minute about the Kresge Foundation for those of you who aren't familiar with us. Kresge is a national philanthropic organization working across the United States. Its purpose is to create opportunities for low-income people in American cities, and our environment program is focused on climate change with the goal of helping cities build their resilience in light of climate change, with their resilience approaches grounded in equity. So one of the things that we do at Kresge is we deploy grant capital, but we also have a very active social investment practice, looking to see how philanthropic capital can leverage private capital into the issues that we care about. So we do program-related investments and mission-related investments as well. So this whole day has been right up my alley, and I'm thrilled to be here. I want to just briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So we have here Sophie Evans. Sophie is Program Director for the Capital Science and Policy Practice at Willis Towers Watson, which is a leading global advisory, broking, and solutions company which seeks innovative uses of risk management and insurance-related mechanisms to build resilient economies and societies. Next to her is Kurt Forsgren. Kurt is Managing Director and Sector Leader for Infrastructure and U.S. Public Finance at S&P Global. He works as an industry analyst across the different infrastructure sectors with a focus on transportation, and in partnership with S&P's Global Infrastructure and Project Finance Group on cross-practice initiatives such as public-private partnerships, green bonds, and examining ESG risks. Next to him is Ryan Mast. Ryan is Director of the Office of Resilience and Sustainability for the City of New Orleans, and also serves as the city's Hazard Mitigation Administrator, and had a role with FEMA before joining the City of New Orleans. And then Jainey Bavishi is the Director of New York City Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency and the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer, where she leads the city's One NYC Resiliency Program, preparing the city for the impacts of climate change and other 21st century threats. So we've got a great group here. And one of the things we talked about a little bit, we've used today the term sustainability, resiliency, and a little bit adaptation, and somewhat interchangeably. There was some talk this morning about how of the dollars for sustainability writ large, a fairly small proportion thus far is focused on adaptation, and we want to talk about that today. And by that we mean preparing for the anticipated impacts of climate change. So we'd like to start with a question around why is building adaptation infrastructure in cities such a high priority? And I thought it would be best to let the cities explain that. So Jainey, could you take a crack at that first and let us know why is it such an urgent priority for New York, and how are you framing the adaptation financing challenge?
Sure, thanks Lois, and thanks to the organizers for including this panel on adaptation finance. It's such an important topic. Of course, for New York City, Hurricane Sandy was a pivotal moment in our climate action agenda. 90,000 buildings were in the inundation zone for Hurricane Sandy. Almost 2 million people were out of power for several weeks, and the city sustained close to $19 billion in damages. So we know that this is an expensive problem. And moving forward, we're not only protecting from the impacts of extreme events, but also from the chronic impacts of climate change. So here in New York, we are privileged to work with an independent panel of scientists called the New York City Panel on Climate Change that are required by law, local law, to provide us with updated climate projections every few years. And their latest projections show that by 2050, we can expect a 4.1 to 5.7 degree Fahrenheit increase in average temperatures, a 4 to 11% increase in annual precipitation, and 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise, on top of a foot of sea level rise we've already witnessed since 1900. That number, by the way, the high-end projections for 2100 go up to 6 feet of sea level rise. So this means that extreme events we know that they will occur, they will become frequent and more intense, and a similar Sandy-like event in 2050, which again cost $19 billion in damages, could cost up to $90 billion in damages. So the city is taking a multi-layered approach to resiliency. We are strengthening coastal protection, we are protecting critical services and infrastructure, we are upgrading buildings, and we're ensuring that neighborhoods are safer and more resilient. And as we do this, we're building protection, but we're also trying to improve the quality of life and livability of neighborhoods. So just as an example of the kind of project we're implementing, there's a project in the east side of Lower Manhattan called the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project. Much of the footprint of the project overlaps with East River Park, where we're providing coastal protection to 110,000 vulnerable New Yorkers through 2.4 miles of enhanced waterfront and urban spaces. And we're basically integrating the flood protection into recreational spaces and other uses of the waterfront so that we can maintain those recreational spaces, improve waterfront access. And by the way, this flood protection will protect a large concentration of public housing and other low-income housing. The entire program that I have described is a $20 billion resiliency program, and much of it is publicly funded for sure. A large part is also federally funded, so $15 billion of the $20 billion approximately comes from federal funding sources. Lois, I'm going to keep going and talk about mainstreaming adaptation, if that's okay?
Yes.
So as we're implementing this program and implementing resilience projects, we are also looking for ways to integrate resilience considerations in the dollars that we already spend. So last year, the mayor's office released a set of climate resiliency design guidelines, which essentially take the projections for sea level rise, storm surge, extreme heat, and extreme precipitation, and provide guidance to designers and engineers on how to incorporate those projections into our buildings and infrastructure projects that the city invests in every day. This is the first of its kind, multi-hazard, comprehensive design guidelines that account for future conditions. And what we're doing here is we're leveraging the dollars that we already spend, the billions of dollars that we spend through our capital programs, to also create a more resilient city. The other thing I want to mention here is that this is not just about physical infrastructure. I think when we think about protecting from the impacts of climate change, we're thinking about walls, we're thinking about floodgates, we're thinking about drainage systems, right? Physical infrastructure. But this is also about building social infrastructure that is more resilient. So last year, New York City released its heat mitigation and adaptation strategy called Cool Neighborhoods NYC. And by the way, most people don't know this, but heat is actually the deadliest climate impact that New York City faces. And so as we were developing this strategy, we knew that social cohesion had to be part of the solution. And so we launched a pilot program called Be a Buddy that works through community-based organizations to pair volunteers with vulnerable citizens, the elderly, the chronically ill, the most vulnerable citizens to the impacts of extreme heat in the most vulnerable areas, to essentially create relationships between these volunteers and vulnerable citizens throughout the year, but relationships that certainly would be leveraged during the time of extremely hot days or heat waves. But there was a conversation that we had to have in the city about how we finance this work. It seemed like the kind of program that would traditionally be financed by philanthropy, but we decided as a city to invest in this type of program. So I think we are also having to think more expansively about the city's role in funding this work and advancing resilience strategies.
Thanks, that's great. And one of the things that we really want to impress upon you is as we think about finance for adaptation, some of it is projects that may just be hard infrastructure for things that are specific to climate, but how do we increasingly, as Jainey said, make sure that as any kind of infrastructure is being built, the future impacts of climate change are explicitly being factored into that? And to what extent then is adaptation finance not something new, but really just another thing that you're building into financing that you need to secure for basic infrastructure construction purposes. Ryan, can we turn to you now to talk a little bit about the experience of New Orleans? Why is adaptation such a critical priority for you? How are you thinking about the extreme events, but also some of the more near-term or more chronic effects that you're experiencing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank host city New York for having us here today to join everybody, as well as C40 for putting this event on and organizing. I think it's fantastic. It's a great opportunity for us to kind of present sort of the ongoing "where are we now" situation with the city of New Orleans. As an emergency manager, if I take that hat and put that on, of course, the urgency of this is, we can just use last year as an example, where we saw the effects of 2 tropical events. We saw our first EF3 tornado ever in the city. We saw multiple cloud bursts, one of which dropped in some parts of the city over 9 inches of rain in a 2.5-hour period. And so it's not that we're changing the types of events that we're seeing, but they're certainly becoming much more extreme, and how we're going to adapt to those and address those is significant. From a resilience officer perspective, we're also looking at the changing climate patterns over time, what that means to coastal land loss and how that's going to impact us both from a storm surge protection measure aspect, but then also as a quality of life aspect for our industry that actually uses that for survival. And then also we have to take into consideration just the age of the city, the age of the infrastructure that we're relying upon to provide protection in these extreme events, and making sure that we're creating good investments in when we renew and upgrade that infrastructure, but also thinking more adaptively in terms of how we can better protect the city in more innovative and more green practices going forward. One of the interesting things about the city is the agency that is most relied upon in a major rain situation to remove the stormwater is also our greatest emitter of the greenhouse gases, right? So there's a relationship there that we need to address and talk through and try and figure out how we can really address that from a holistic and comprehensive manner. Since 2005, we have seen a lot of investment in the city and infrastructure, especially in the gray infrastructure and protection measures. We still, at this point, are doing a lot of the major underground infrastructure work that's going to be ongoing for several years, but also in the last 4 to 5 years, we're starting to put to use additional federal funds for hundreds of millions of dollars worth of green infrastructure to help support this work going forward. Of course, you have the upfront cost of building these, which is significant, and we're very grateful for the federal investment in order to provide this for our city. But we have to look long-term at what the operation and maintenance costs of these are going to be. I think nobody in this room would argue that the dangers of allowing complacency in these systems over time, what those impacts can be for a city. And so that's one of the things that we really want to look at when we're going forward, is not just how are we creating smart investments in them, but how are we making sure that these investments are sustainable. Much like New York, we're also considering the equity factors of this, not just on the social cohesion, not just on the inclusion in that from a planning perspective, and addressing and making sure our programs provide for equitable outcomes with our vulnerable populations. But realistically, what we're looking at this is, what is the economic impact of this on a city that really is in need of different industries to help generate additional jobs. And so that's one of the things that we want to look at as we move forward, and why I think sustainable financing for these types of projects in the long term is so important. If we are trying to create an industry around a water economy, if we're trying to create a really sustainable system of how we live with water, and how we as residents from there are the global leaders in some of these adaptation practices, then we really need to consider how are we going to finance that in the long term. We can't just create jobs. We can't just use the jobs from a project to drive a whole education system around this, a workforce development program around this. It's something that we're already working on. We are investing millions of dollars in workforce development programs for the green infrastructure projects that we already have in queue. But long-term wise, we wanted to make sure that we're creating those pathways so so that we're not just developing and doing the programs and the projects that are going to protect us as a city, but that we're also improving the lives of people and building wealth, both for the household wealth and then the wage growth over time within the city as an equitable impact to this.
Thanks, that's great. As you were talking about the equitable outcomes, I was reminded of a statement from a session I had the chance to attend in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Lisa, at MIT, a session about finance for resilience. And one of the speakers was Larry Vail from MIT, and he summed it up thinking about investments in adaptation. He said it all boils down to who wins, who loses, and who chooses. And those are pretty profound things that we don't have time to talk about in this session, but really are worth pondering as we think about what is the resilience agenda that we have for cities. So Kurt, I want to turn it to you now to help us think about what are the business model challenges that are unique to adaptation infrastructure, and how do you think about how finance for adaptation differs or doesn't differ from finance for other kind of infrastructure, and what are you observing in the cities that you're working with, and how are you thinking about how rating agencies are factoring climate risks into their assessments of city ratings for credit?
Sure, thank you.
That's just a few things in 7 minutes.
You'll have to prompt me for the other questions, but thank you, Lois, and thank you for inviting S&P to participate in this. It's an important event, and we hear a lot about credit ratings throughout the day, and I think I'd add to the comments made at MIT one other question, that is who pays. And I think that's ultimately our job as a credit rating agency is to evaluate the risk proposition associated with these. But I think thinking about sort of adaptation specifically, I think some of the knocks on the challenges of that is sort of ascribing benefits and then ascribing the benefits to those who ultimately pay. They tend to be large projects, very lumpy, and I think ultimately, our job is to try to evaluate the credit risk, and that's kind of a very narrow band, and I think maybe we can touch upon this later, but part of the language of risk, I think, we think needs to change and talk more about long-term risks as opposed to near-term risks. And so we've looked at and evaluated and created some kind of options for the marketplace beyond credit ratings that can talk about and look at the risks associated with environmental credentials, resiliency, and ultimately kind of a broader asset entity-level ESG kind of assessment. But just looking at adaptation financing specifically, while there are challenges, I think, and I come from the public finance group, it's an area that it knows very well how to finance public goods and does it at quite a volume every year. And so I don't think the challenges are that great. We heard earlier today about the wall of money out there that needs the wall of projects to come and meet it. But I'd say, and I have colleagues here today from S&P who can ascribe to the fact that we see these transactions on a daily basis, whether they're labeled resilient, whether they're labeled green or not. They finance critical infrastructure at the local level, and we see financing tools that run the spectrum. I think one of the fascinating things for me, we're personally working in public finance, having looked across various sectors in S&P, corporate finance, project finance, is really the creativity associated with public finance. And ultimately, as I mentioned, these are projects that we rate and see every day. So they can be secured by a revenue stream, they can be secured by a pool. We have state infrastructure banks, we've got municipal utility districts, we've got community facilities authorities. I mean, there's no shortage of acronyms out there that really can be, and are on a daily basis being used to finance projects. Now, you can call them resilient projects or green projects, but they're getting done, and they're getting done on a highly rated basis largely.
One of the things I'd like to ask a follow-up on, you mentioned about the creativity that's being applied in some of these projects. What do you see about the capacities that need to exist within cities to be able to engage in those kind of creative finance projects. We've had some comments earlier in the day about the bridges that need to be built between the treasurers and the finance people and the sustainability staff. Do you have any advice for the cities around that, or advice for your colleagues in the world of finance around that?
Yeah, I'm explicitly told not to give advice, but I can make some observations about what we see. I think we heard a lot about it earlier today about sort of the bespoke nature of some of these transactions. They highly specialized, unique to situations, and then in the same panel we heard about the ability to scale them up. And obviously credit ratings are meant to be sort of a commodity, right? They're a capital market commodity. They're a language of risk that can be applied globally. And so to make the most of the capital markets, you really need to have scale. You need to have uniformity. You need to have structure that's ratable. And by ratable, I mean we have to be able to identify revenue streams, ascribe risk to those, and we need to have the data to be able to do that. So it really is a combination of disclosure and data, and a uniformity to the structure that allows us to focus on the risks. And we can talk about how to bundle things later, but ultimately putting them together into packages where we can, by risk, identify different levels of risk, much like securitization, but this is a municipal kind of like concept, but we have municipal pools that effectively do the same thing. So it's really improved data and the ability for us to analyze and having the access to the structure that allows us to basically rate it.
Thank you. Sophie, I want to turn to you. Yesterday, when we had the chance to talk briefly, you were talking about risk and how you're in the business of that and figuring that out. And I wondered if you could talk about some examples from your work with different clients. How have you seen them approaching finance for adaptation and resilience projects? And what about risk can be figured out and what can't, or is it all solvable?
Big question. And I echo my panel. Thank you very much for having me. I am always delighted to participate on innovative financing panels. And I'm lucky enough to be asked. And then I throw in the fact that my company has its roots in 1828 and go, I'm not sure insurance is the innovation financing mechanism that everybody seems to think it is. But there are definitely innovations within the sector and within the risk sector and risk financing that we can point to begin to solve some of the challenges that we have across geographies. So you very kindly introduced me saying, I work in climate risk insurance, and that's particularly about how we apply what the insurance industry has done for the last 200 or 300 years and the last 20 years with a deep understanding of data and analytics, and apply that to new challenges and to new areas of financing and to new kind of global problems, really. And why I like to work in insurance is that it's a scale question, but also if you approach it as an institution of society, it is flexible and tailorable enough that you can really adapt insurance and risk financing to help solve some of those problems. So I think I'm very grateful to go last because you guys really set the problem, and we were reflecting yesterday about the workshop, the adaptation workshop we were on, and I'm been a part of the GARI working group, which some of you be familiar with if not members, and Jay's not here, but please sign up. It's an open group. And we often go off in our kind of private sector land and go, so it's like 4 trillion here, and then we can do like 10 trillion over there, and we'll just wrap things around it, and the capital markets are open, don't worry about it. And actually coming back down to the city level it really puts us in our place as the private sector and private financing sector in a way that is so productive, I think, to trying to tailor-make solutions. And these are public-private solutions. But I wanted to, we had an open session yesterday, and I hope the discussions continue tomorrow. But sending us the exam question, and I say us, us on this side, and is how we fix that problem. Because otherwise, the private sector will just keep coming and saying, we can finance that, don't worry about it. And although people are the 1 trillion for Houston, I'm sure we can get that, don't worry about it. If I can, I know this is a kind of a US-focused audience, although I can see some colleagues from development banks and things like that. I wanted to just use two examples that I think will address the scale issue and will speak to the flexibility of insurance and risk pooling, and also allow us to explore how we can achieve both the financing returns that we want to and the protection we want to, and also some of the co-benefits and societal co-benefits that we also know that as policymakers we have to address, and as financiers we have to address. So one example is the CRIF, and that is a Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, acronym buzzer, and initialism buzzer, sorry. And it's a multi-sovereign catastrophe risk pool. Told you insurance was catchy. So it's started in 2007. It's got 12 member governments, and it to date has paid out $130.5 million in claims for hurricanes, tropical cyclone hurricanes. And the reason I speak to the innovation, it's the first sovereign level risk pool. So there's governments pooling their risk together, creating a mutual insurance company, which is then reinsured through the London insurance market. But the innovation is not only the collection of countries coming together, but really the use of something called parametric insurance, which speaks to Kurt's point on the data and analytics. And I apologize, I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with this, but parametric insurance is not indemnity-based. So you have no loss adjustment. It is triggered on an event, which in the case of the CRIF in the Caribbean is a wind speed of a certain height, or a certain wind speed, comes in and triggers an index and automatically triggers a payout. And they are legally required to pay out if that's triggered within 14 days. So if you imagine and apply that where there's no loss adjustment, there's no discussion between, is it a federal budget, is it a national budget, is it a city budget? If that sort of innovation, which is clear-cut based on the science and data that now all of the financial markets are very comfortable with, we can then really revolutionize how we do disaster risk financing. That's pretty cool. There is another example called the African risk capacity that takes that idea to the public-private schemes and actually attaches conditions on how you pay the claim. So you have to do 2 years of technical capacity building before you're eligible to join the African risk capacity. So these are sub-Saharan African countries who are doing the same thing, pooling their drought risk. And they spend 2 years going through the motions with international development banks, with the UN and others, and the World Food Programme is a big part of that, and the private sector saying, right, in the event of an event, we have a triggered event, i.e. not enough rain, how are we going to spend that money? And some of that money goes to school feeding programs, to your societal resilience point. It goes back to the communities where that money needs to be spent. It's earmarked. So you can do structured and cohesive planning because you know in the event you're going to get this much money. Again, it pays out within 14 days. So there are some innovations out there that although I'm discussing the sovereign level, I think can be really applicable to the city level. So I'm going to stand here and say, if we want to achieve the scale, if we want to achieve the bankability that we know comes from the big numbers, let's talk about risk pooling for cities. That's my one key takeaway for today, but we can chat about it in more detail. And there's lots of people in the audience who have already been toying around with this idea. But how about we talk about the Eastern Seaboard, who have a similar set of risks, a similar set of infrastructure financing challenges, who may want to think about how they can collectively come together as cities, maybe using C40 or others, to really get that bankability, get that scale that we know that we need to unlock the capital and demonstrate resilience not only to the financial markets, but also to those policy makers and to those people who have to justify their city-based financing decisions they make every day.
That's pretty fascinating. And in that particular example about the East Coast cities, has there been a conversation initiated about that? Is that a new idea? Who in the cities has the knowledge of how that might work to be an effective person sitting at the table, the solution table?
So I'm not going to take the credit for it because I might. You guys don't know. I'm kidding. I'm not taking the credit for it. And like maybe we can speak to some of the colleagues there. But I know this is something that's being explored in some of the cities in the South and certainly on the East Coast and definitely on the West Coast. There's an element of who moves first, and so I'm just kind of standing here as part of the private financing community, saying that, you know, when that leadership is taken and demonstrated, that we stand by to support those decisions, and we'll bring the markets along with us.
All right, Jainey or Ryan, anything you want to jump in and add at this point in time? Okay. I want to then ask a little bit about, yesterday, as was already mentioned, there was a workshop that was specific about adaptation finance. You were there for part of it, Kurt. The other three were all speakers at it. Then you had some workshop time. Were there any particular aha moments you had during that session, or any new questions that emerged from your participation in that?
I think that for me, it was reassuring that there are so many different actors in the private finance sector, and that being defined very broadly: insurance, asset managers, private equity, banks, that are thinking about resilience and adaptation finance. And so while, I think we had some great conversations yesterday, I don't think we figured it all out yet. There was no silver bullet solution that I heard in our 7 hours of discussion. But I think that there are a lot of conversations to follow up on. So just as Sophie said, that the conversation, bringing cities into the room, was grounding for the private sector, I think for me, from a city perspective, it sort of broadened our horizons to hear the level of thinking and level of work that's already happening in the private sector. And now we just have to be much better about making those connections, continuing those conversations, and then piloting some of these innovative ideas in real places, on real projects, so that we can understand not only how they work, but how to measure the impacts of those strategies.
Yeah, I think for me, it's been a tremendous, 48 hours of learning all this. Number one is I need to bring a dictionary, or maybe get a vocabulary book to understand what some of these things mean. But what that speaks to is what some other of the panelists have said today, which is we do speak different languages. We have different vocabularies, but we're speaking to the same thing. And so putting us in a room and forcing us to understand the other point of view, or what that might mean, or how that is beneficial to our own work, is really significant. I guess more than just significant, it's necessary in order to move the needle forward on this. I rack my brain every single day on figuring out how to finance some of these great ideas that we have, or how to continue to build upon the pilots that we have had that are so effective. And I come here yesterday and I'm like, oh, well, green bonds were just, if you can make this work and this work, that's great. Or, we've been discussing parametric policies for a long time, but just haven't quite been able to whittle it down to something that's actually really effective for us. And then an evening discussion kind of gives me a lot more insight into how I can sort of frame the questions as we move forward with this. And so I think this has been the part of just understanding the other world a lot more, and how that fits into what we're trying to accomplish is just incredibly significant moving forward. I think that's going to be, and these are going to give us the tools in which to do that. About 30 minutes ago, I just got an additional tool on the policy recommendations that I'm going to put forward on electric buses in 2 months. Now I have more ammunition for that as well. And so these things I think, can't be understated in terms of how important this is. And I'm very grateful to have some partners with us from the New Orleans Finance Authority with us alongside this, because moving forward, that partnership is going to be key to being able to realize some of the goals that we're trying to reach as a city.
And I think, Lois, I worked for 15 years in our San Francisco office, so the California State Coastal Conservation Commission, I think is the name, but there was a case study example yesterday that talked about, it wasn't called an adaptation tax, it was called a parcel tax, that they were able to, after a lot of polling and a lot of creative, I think, positioning in terms of timing, they were able to get approval by the voters of the 9 Bay Area counties that effectively provided a revenue source for them to tackle some of the adaptation issues that they're tackling at that regional level. Again, it's a common practice to have special assessments or other parcel taxes or other kind of forms of public finance, and to leverage that to achieve certain policy objectives or finance certain infrastructure projects. So I think for me that was takeaway, not that it was surprising to me, but again, sort of to see the lights go on in people's eyes, like, oh, wait, we can do this. And effectively is a tool that we see every day in public finance.
Well, that is one of the things that's interesting, is to think about where are there places where there's enough political will to vote themselves to create a tax that does create that revenue stream, and how can you cultivate that otherwise if it doesn't exist. We're at a time in both New Orleans and New York City where a lot of the investments you've been able to make have been because your communities incurred terrible tragedies that brought a lot of federal money in. So as you're both looking at time when some of that federal money may be disappearing, what does that prompt for you in terms of the personnel power that you want to deploy toward looking into other financing mechanisms?
Well, I think one thing that in New Orleans we're certainly not just considering, but implementing and including in when we do our green infrastructure projects and other programs that we're moving forward, which is collecting a lot of really good data and using that to demonstrate the effectiveness of the programs and the plans that we move forward. Because the reality is the needle doesn't move any further on that in terms of going to the public for an additional tax or a fee or additional funding in this if they don't trust that what you're doing is actually helping them. And so building that public trust is key to this, and it's highlighted in even something that seems so benign and so important out in California with the case study yesterday that still took 8 years in order to get to that point. Now think about something that is perhaps a little more innovative or something that isn't as necessarily visible, such as flood protection and what that means. And perhaps the amount that you're going to have to ask for and over time is going to be significant in an area that is already majority low to moderate income and that is already very adverse to additional taxation. And so I think that trust, using data to show over time the effectiveness of these programs, showing along the way how it is a net gain in terms of what these investments are going to show is kind of key to that. As we also use that same data to show in the financial markets the effectiveness of what we're trying to do in our strategies, right? So we have a plan, we are implementing the elements of this is how it's functioning over time, and here's what the benefit cost analysis shows. Here's our ratio over time and how that's going to really demonstrate the effectiveness of the programs.
Jainey?
We're certainly committed to exploring alternative finance strategies, and I think the challenge here is not so much a question of personnel power, it's a question of what solutions are actually available. And the toolkit is still pretty limited. And so, I think partnerships are incredibly important to this, and the more actors we can get to the table that come with different perspectives and with tried and true strategies from infrastructure financing more broadly, the better off we are in terms of being able to think creatively about how to solve these challenges. And in the meantime, as I mentioned before, we're also thinking very hard about how we build a culture of resilience in the city and how we create the policy tools and levers so that every dollar we spend is a contribution towards building a more resilient city. And we're not just thinking about resilience projects in a silo.
Sophie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, just on that projects piece, I think something that came out yesterday and is very prescient for me as we talk a lot with different, we've heard a lot about different sorts of capital, different pots of capital, is how we collaborate to help the public sector actors who are tasked with not only financing infrastructure builds, but operating, maintenance costs, which often are a struggle to finance, is how we can help build financial structures to protect the adaptation gains, so that it's not an adaptation spend that in 3 years' time is insufficient, as we heard from Houston, or that in 10 years' time isn't quite delivering what it was financed to do, right? So that you're not losing pots of capital in that way. So I'd like to, offering how we can think about adding risk elements, or whether using different different market products, and Kurt was talking about different capital market initiatives, so that we can make sure that as city officials, our applying for grant funding or applying for different revenue streams, or making the difficult financial decisions that people have to make, right? Is it pot A, is it pot B, column C? That we can finance that in a way, or support that financing to protect those gains, so that you know that the resilient decisions you are making now will be resilient over a longer period of time than you had hoped.
If I may, one of the things that Sophie and I were talking about during the coffee break was that what we really need is some kind of analysis of adaptation typologies and then the financing strategies that might actually advance those typologies. So as C40 is launching this adaptation finance program, if this is something that you all could look into, it would be incredibly helpful, because I think that as an adaptation professional in a city, I don't know where to start in terms of thinking about which financing mechanism I may want to deploy for a particular adaptation solution. And by the way, the toolkit of adaptation solutions is also still coming together. The technology is changing every day. This is a very emerging space. And so with two emerging spaces, it's hard to connect the dots sometimes. And the extent to which we can make those connections more obvious, I think the better off we are.
And I would just add to that complicating things is the notion that resilience is not an end state. It's a continuous process, as is adaptation. So it's not like you could have do your adaptation effort, check the box, and you're done, because conditions are going to be continuing to change. So how in that sort of dynamic environment do we think about the nature of investment, the nature of monitoring? And an important point from yesterday's discussion that the rating agencies both raised was the difference between the catastrophic events, which do lend themselves more toward insurance, and the ongoing chronic stresses. So as sea level slowly rises, as temperatures slowly rise, as drought worsens, like how do you think about how those challenges are managed? And then we don't have time for it now, unless someone asks a question about it. But the really interesting interplay between the nature of risks that are introduced by climate change and how the rating agencies are assessing the creditworthiness of cities. And there was an interesting comment made yesterday about, are we going to get penalized because we had this terrible storm? And the answer was no, not so much. What we're going to be looking at is, what did you do in response to it? And what fundamental capacity are you proactively developing around climate that actually would show that you're being deliberate and thoughtful and planful about what it means. Did I just summarize that well?
Very good.
Okay. We've got about 8 minutes left, and so that we've got plenty of time for questions. I'd like to turn it to the floor and see if there are any questions folks have.
But we're aware we're standing between you and a drink, maybe, so.
Don't be shy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, while you're thinking, I'm going to pose one more question that we had talked about. Oh, you want to?
I have a question too. We heard yesterday about some of the financing projects and some of the pipeline from some of the cities. Given that we've got some financial sector people in the room, did you guys want to say like what your immediate next steps of what you need financed and what you want to work on, or is there a specific project that you guys would like to explore? Or? The answer could be no.
Well, I think there's a few things just to kind of speak on, maybe highlighting where we're at, like what are we doing right now, and what's our next steps, just holistically. So some of the things in the last year that we've come to, or that we've launched, or that we're starting, or that we're moving forward in is so last year we did launch our climate action plan and strategy. This year we are working on our comprehensive recovery plan, and then so that will be in development next year. And then what we're doing is we're synthesizing and ingraining all of those into a planning cycle long-term and building equity, resilience, and climate action into all of our both emergency management but also future development planning. So that's on the planning side of what we're working on. We did launch the first phase of our bike share program in January of this year, and we're hoping to continue to grow that. throughout the city. We are in design on several of large-scale green infrastructure projects, and so now the next phase of that is going to be really taking advantage of our green space in order to continue to build capacity in it, because those are the areas that already naturally have lagoons for water storage, and so if we can increase the capacity of those and build in weirs so that will reduce the burden on our stormwater system, that's going to be a natural way to improve our infrastructure over time. On the energy side, we are going through our downtown energy challenge right now for benchmarking in our major energy users in our downtown district, and we're moving forward with the proposal of a benchmarking ordinance citywide later this year. On the alternative energy side, we're also going to be piloting a microgrid project at some point this year. We're currently scoping that out. One thing that we're really looking at is the utilization, which we know in other cities this has been really effective, the utilization of brown fields to act as locations for solar installations, and then figuring out creative ways with which the residents in that area can capitalize on that.
Questions in the audience?
Yes, hello. I'm Milton Bevington. I'm a teacher of management at UMass Boston, working on a project for the city of Boston on climate resiliency finance. My particular field is energy infrastructure finance. You just mentioned microgrids. I hadn't heard anything like that, and I'm kind of interested in, rather than the disaster recovery aspects of this, how do we make sure we have a hardened energy infrastructure? Has anybody got any thoughts on that?
We've been very focused on hardening our energy infrastructure since Sandy, and Con Ed, our utility here in New York City, has actually invested $1 billion into hardening the electric, energy, and natural grid infrastructure across the city. We're great partners with them, and we're also now sort of taking the work a step further and looking at infrastructure interdependencies between the energy infrastructure and other infrastructure systems we rely on, such as transportation, telecommunications, wastewater, sewer, things like that.
Yeah, in the city of New Orleans, so Entergy is our utility for that provides energy for that, and it's actually regulated by our city council. And so, as part of that, there is a push to create additional hardening within the system, as well as redundancies within it. So that's one of the things that they're working on. One, from our office perspective, what we're considering to try and recommend is, as we look and do these energy upgrades, is there ways that we can look at distributed energy as well as a sort of a solution? So that's some of the things that we're considering.
Hi, thank you all for your contributions. My name's Margot, and I run a company called My Strong Home that fortifies homes against hurricane and tornado risk and finances it with the insurance savings that accrue on the back end. And we work in New Orleans as well as, 5 states across the Southeast and Gulf Coast. But I guess, Sophie, a question for you. Outside of the sort of sovereign risk instrument domain, have you seen other examples of insurance-based innovation? I mean, given the costs of cat risk, you would think there's any number of insurance-based ways to convert that into preventative, resilience investments, and yet the theory and the practice, at least from where we sit, feel pretty far apart. And we want to find peers because we want to be wrestling with the operational challenges together. And it's been lonely, if I'm honest. So anyway, I'm curious if you've seen anything, sub-sovereign government level.
Yeah, we've seen a lot, and I think parametric insurance is a really interesting way to begin to explore that. We know your organization very well, so I'm really pleased that you're here, and it was an excellent question. I think what we, and I say this as a Brit representing the London insurance market, the US insurance market has some challenges and some curious nuances that we, coming as an international firm, sometimes it takes us a while to grapple with. I think we're pretty much there. And of course, the domestic market here is incredibly strong and a key participant in this space. What I think we need to do, and I'm lucky enough to be an insurance broker, so I can help frame the question sometimes in a bit differently to those who might, underwriters, is begin to use insurance as a reward mechanism. And I think that's how we might be looking to shift the needle so that when you are, My Strong Home and Fortified, you are the freeboard, any of those efforts an individual or a community or a town or a city takes to demonstrate their proactivity and then their increased resilience. And to be honest, that the work to translate what may appear uncertain into a concrete set of risks, then insurance can be used and engaged as a way to reward the good behavior, and that isn't necessarily an innovation, but it's a big shift, I think, a mindset shift on how we do really good disaster risk management or low-level risk management, because your point was very well taken from the cats and the extremes all the way down to the sunny day floodings that I know are problematic for a lot of the cities in the room, for example. So I think that's something there that we can help collectively, and that's not. I don't think I think we're pretty close. I've got a lot of. I'm perpetual optimist in that way, which is weird working in cat risk. But I do think there is something there that we can definitely explore, and I know that a community level might be a really interesting way to begin to have those discussions, and certainly the 5 areas that you're working in.
We have time for one last question, if there is one.
Thank you so much, an excellent panel. So, Joyce Coffey with Climate Resilience Consulting. I'm interested in knowing that climate change is one precipitator for migration of populations and demographic shifts, either within a city, between cities, or even between nations, Syria as an example. If any of you have thought about the tax implications or usage fee implications as your populations shift around from the perspective of both debt servicing your current projects or even thinking about how and where you design your projects.
These are incredibly important questions and not ones that we are going to have time to get into today, but we certainly are thinking more and more about this. The Department of City Planning here in New York City recently created a new zoning designation called Special Coastal Risk Districts, which was applied to some of the most high-risk, vulnerable neighborhoods, and after a great deal of public engagement, these zoning designations essentially allow for de-densification as the only development option in these areas. And so there are a lot of implications that go along with that, and ones that we're just beginning to understand.
Yeah, I would echo that. This is certainly something that we are talking about and discussing and figuring out how to sort of address this in our long-term planning. From our perspective, of course, in the coastal environment where you do see coastal communities having to start to consider whether they're going to have to relocate, and we have Ile de St. Charles as an example that's going through that right now in Terrebonne Parish. As the city sort of behind the wall, there's two things to consider there. One is, what is our risk factor long term for ensuring that, and to ensure that protection measure still remains in place and to the standard that it provides certification for insurability of everything behind there. But then also on the receivership of, if these communities start to have to move, but they still want to be close to where they have their industry or their homes or where they're familiar with it, that may increase our population. And so fortunately, as the city, it's, our population still is not at what its peak was. Our peak population was back in the 60s and 70s, and so the city is actually, the land mass and the area for that is actually much larger, the capacity-wise, than what our current population is. But how that happens and what that means for those folks and what are the equity factors that are included in that are certainly going to be something that's going to be really important as we look forward to that.
So we're out of time. Thank you, panelists. You were all brilliant. Really appreciate your comments.